Hello, it's another glorious morning here at the house that sat down. A little bit early, I've left the teenagers in bed and I've come out to have a little chat about using watercolour washes in paintings. But this tutorial is also about what to do when things go wrong. In my opinion, completing a painting can be a little bit like writing a book. You don't always get it right first time, but you have got to do that very first draft. And then maybe think about it. And then there comes the editing process and it can be improved on subsequent drafts. So I'm going to show you two paintings today. They're quite similar, similar concept behind them, but the first one didn't quite go to plan, and then I thought about it for a little bit and I had another go the next day. And I'm really quite pleased with the results. So my plan is to show you first the painting that didn't go to plan, and then the one that came afterwards, because I think the second painting is improved massively on the first. But perhaps you can decide what you think. Here we go. The initial inspiration of this particular piece was the beautiful rainbows that I've seen posted up around the village by the children. And I wanted to have a go myself, so I thought it was a perfect example of the sort of situation where you might want to be using watercolour washes. So it's a good idea to actually use a watercolour pad that has been designed for extremely wet work. Now this is a block of watercolour that I've bought that's been gummed on all four sides, which means it's actually stuck down, and you need to leave it like that until the painting has been completed and is fully dry. The other piece of equipment I'm using is masking fluid. Now I don't often use this, but it's quite useful for this particular effect. And I've marked out the impression of some tall pieces of wavy grass that come up from the bottom of the watercolour paper into the centre of the painting. There's just a few of them. And once that's dried, then I'm going to start by putting on the washes. I'm using a large, bushy, fine bristled brush. And it's extremely wet. I've got the paint very wet, and I'm just laying on the first wash along the top there. There we go, trying to make it nice and dark. It always dries lighter than you expect. Now it's important in between to clean the original colour off in water and then start again with the next colour down. Now I do want them to bleed into each other, so I'm actually actively encouraging that as I push the orange across under the red, making it patchy and darker. I don't necessarily want an even spread or even an even line across. And then I've washed the orange off and I've gone into the light yellow. And again, I'm encouraging the paints to bleed into each other, being very careful to wash off the mixed colours and then go back in for a darker yellow. Doing quite a wide layer of yellow there. Okay. After I'm finished with the yellow, I'm very careful again to clean the brush off. In fact, one of the tips for this particular style of painting is to have several different pots of water with you so that you can have access to a lot of clean water. Again, I'm encouraging the paint to bleed upwards, almost to give you the impression of a distant tree line. So that was the first green, more of a blue green. I'm now coming in with the sap green underneath it. Again, to give the impression of another layer of trees in front of the first layer of trees. And I'm giving that a fairly solid line along the middle there. So the next idea I had was that there would be some water. The paint isn't quite moving in the way I'd like it to, so I'm just propping the top of the pad up very slightly so that the paint starts to run down rather than up now. because the concept of this section of the painting towards the bottom is that the bushes that I've painted in will actually be reflected in what is now water. So we started with a sort of a lighter blue into a darker blue, thinking of the colours of the rainbow, more of an indigo, and then down to a purple or a violet at the bottom. But at this stage I'm not that happy with it because I think the colours are really quite pale, and I wanted to, this is where I made my fatal mistake, I went back in at the top to try and darken the red. Because it just looked a little too wishy-washy for me. And it was the mistake, because once you've laid a wash on, it's never a good idea to go in and tamper with it. And you can see what I'm doing is actually encouraging it to spread down too far. And some of the colours are mixing, and I'm just not happy with it. Yes, you can see it bleeding far too far down. So this is the dry painting, and just to demonstrate how to split the paper off from the pad, pop a knife into the little hole that's very conveniently left at the bottom edge, and then run it carefully all the way round, and your painting lifts off, which is quite good. Now, still on there, we have got our masking fluid. I haven't taken that off yet. There's an extra little bit to this painting that I'm about to do now, because it's not completely finished, and even though I'm not happy with the wash at the top, I am going to finish it to demonstrate where I was going. So I'm using a very long, fine bristled brush, and I'm rolling it in some very, very deep purple. Coming up from the bottom of the painting, I'm going to be dragging in some very fine leaves of grass in that dark purple to give you the impression that you're looking across the water to the forest through long grasses. It's quite effective. Putting quite a nice thick growth of grass along the bottom there, again in that dark purple. And now we come to the point where it's fully dry, and I'm just peeling off the masking fluid. Now you have to be really gentle as you coax this off so that you don't tear the paper underneath and actually tear off some of the paint. But it does leave quite a nice impression. And a feeling of depth and highlight on some of the grasses that are growing in front of your forest. I wouldn't usually bother to use the masking fluid because if you know where the highlights are going to be in your painting, you can usually leave that section of the paper free. But under the circumstances with the washes, it is the only way to achieve this particular effect. I quite like it, but as I said in the introduction, I was really quite disappointed with the overall effect, simply because the washes just got away from me and I was really cross with myself. So I put it away and had a little think about it. And once I got over being cross about it, I had another look at it, and actually it's not as bad as I thought it was. I don't like it when paintings don't go to plan. I don't like to be defeated, and so I had quite a long think about it overnight and decided to swap the rainbow round completely. And so here we are now, having a different interpretation of the rainbow. Now you can see I've started at the top with yellow. And then I've come down into the orange and the red. And I'm putting really quite a strong red through there, right across the middle of the painting. And then I'm going to leave that to dry. So that's left until the next day when I put the next layer on, but I forgot to press record on the camera. This is part of my different rainbow, because after the red, we've gone into purple, and I put a layer of purple along the lower edge of the red. It's quite interesting, and actually I've gone slightly below where the red stopped, which gives you two tones, even though it's the same purple in that whole section across the middle of the painting. The section that's over the red obviously goes a lot darker, and then once the red is finished, below that you actually get the true violet purple colour, and I think that's really quite nice. It almost gives you the impression of trees in the very far distant and then a field in the very far distant. And then we come over again, and I've remembered to press record now, with a dark blue, almost an indigo, which I'm going to pop in below and slightly over that purple layer, encouraging the shapes again of trees in the distance. So we've got a sort of like a middle distance here now. Which I think is quite effective. And just dabbing the paint on and encouraging it to move around a little bit. I'm going to pull that all the way across that purple layer, and then slightly further down as well, so that we have a two-tone effect again, with a layer of blue showing more purely below where the purple finishes. I think it works really rather nicely. Again, we're building up a sense of depth in this painting, giving the impression of a misty field perhaps, where you haven't quite got a lot of detail, but you know there's something there. Now I'm breaking up the layers of blue now, putting a little bit of dark in as well, and then I'm going to let that dry. So each colour I put on now will be allowed to dry before the next one goes on. So we're going into a much lighter blue now. This is more of an ultramarine, and it's the impression of a body of water, maybe a stream, maybe a lake. I'm not giving too much detail away on that one. I think the person viewing the painting can decide that for themselves. Instead of using the upward strokes now, we're stroking across the painting, which will again reinforce the concept of water. Okay, speeding it up a little bit. Obviously bleeding up into the dark blue and then coming down and forward. And at the end of this section, you'll notice that I've encouraged it in the middle of the painting, but not at the edges. And the reason for that will become clear once we move on to the green. Okay, so here we have the green coming in, which is quite a dark green, a blue, dark bluey green. And gone back to giving the impression of little bushes, maybe, rather than trees, little bushes this time, and areas of grassland. It's patchy, it's not a solid colour. I'm suggesting that the grasses and little bushes are moving down towards the water. There we go, just encouraging little spiky bits, and then a little bit more on the other side. Now this has the effect of drawing the eye into the centre of the painting, something that I've discussed before. Little sections of grassland poking out into the water, and as we come closer and closer to us, there's a little bit more detail. So that has also dried now, and we're going in now with a lovely light green. Wonderful. It doesn't really matter which specific green you use. I would just go on instinct with whatever colours you've got. After all, this is certainly an unusual take on a landscape and an unusual take on a rainbow, as our rainbow's a little bit inside out here. Okay, again, leaving some white and different strengths of green. It's the same green but different strengths, just to give a sense of texture. There we go. Just having a little bit of fun with that, really. Now, Once that's completely dry, I'm going with another very dark green now. This is a sap green, one of my favourites, and as I've said before, it works incredibly well with this light green. Coming up from the bottom of the paper, implying quite a thick growth of tall grass. Again, pointing up into the painting and drawing the eye up. Works quite well. Some nice darker ones going on as well as lighter ones at the back. And now I'm going back to my very long, thin, bristled brush that I've dragged into some paint and rolled to make it really, really thin. And I'm just putting some extra strokes in just to pull the whole painting together. Now, on reflection, I wonder whether this perhaps was too much. I don't know. You can decide that for yourself. I perhaps got a little bit too heavy-handed here. I don't know. I don't know. Putting a little bit of grass in the top there. I think it's quite nice. And now that it's completely dry, again, we need to be peeling off the masking tape and being really very gentle with it. It's quite therapeutic doing this, actually, as long as you are just patient and very, very careful. Firm, gentle upward strokes to just encourage that gum off the paper. There we go, I'll speed that up a little bit. And I am quite pleased with the finished painting. Certainly an unusual rainbow anyway. Okay, so that's the two paintings that I was talking about, one after another. And actually, I do genuinely think the second one is an improvement on the first one. There are several things I would still like to change about it, and I may well have another go. But I won't bore you with filming that one. You've probably had enough from me right now. Although I will be back later in the week because I've been inspired to do another rainbow painting, but this time on a much bigger canvas using acrylics. So I'm hoping that you will join me for that, and I look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, do please take care of yourselves.